I'm going to bring you another fascinating game from Mikhail Tal. This time it's against Larsen in the Candidates Tournament of 1965. Here Tal was white, Larsen's black, and Tal played 1e4 and Larsen decided to play the Sicilian, and we get into a Sicilian Scheveningen with knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes and e6 from Larsen. Tal followed up with knight c3 and d6 is played, followed by bishop to e3 and now knight to f6. And the point for black now is that they've played d6 and e6 here, so they've got a very nice central structure. So they're basically keeping back and controlling the d5 and e5 square, so this could be very tricky for white. But here Tal follows up with f4 and plays an attacking variation. Black follows up with bishop e7 and now Tal plays queen to f3. The idea for white now is very simple, just to launch these g and h pawns up along with the f pawn and try and get an amazing attack and win the game. Black castles straight into this and now white is forced to castle queenside. Here Larsen played queen to c7. I think he was hoping here for g4 straight away from Tal, because then after knight takes and rook takes, black can play e5, rook c4 and bishop takes g4, and Larsen's seen this before and things are relatively even. Instead though, after queen c7, Tal follows up with knight d to b5, attacking the queen, and the queen's forced to move to a horrible square on b8. But now Tal can finally play g4, where he's launching his kingside attack. Here Larsen played a6, attacking the knight. The knight's booted away to d4 and two captures take place, and Larsen here played b5. e5 may have been a better move. After e5, g5 could be played, followed by bishop g4, and we get into this interesting variation, just queen g3, and if the bishop takes d1, this is actually quite bad because g takes f6 and bishop takes f6 followed by knight d5, where f6 is under attack. But if after queen g3 black takes on d4, rook takes d4 and bishop e6, g takes and bishop takes, after rook to d1 and the smoke's cleared, this is definitely an interesting game for both sides. Both sides have an attack here. White's attacking on the king side, black's attacking on the queen side, and anything can happen here. The computer actually gives it as dead even, but this would make a very interesting middle game study to see who comes out on top in this position. But here Larsen played b5, and now g5 from Tal, attacking the knight. The knight's forced to move to d7. So here we have a very interesting story. Initially Tal was going to play a3 here, and in his own words be a coward to protect himself from b4, and after a takes, queen takes, rook g1, white's actually doing fine. Here white can also play h4, which the computer has given, and after b4, knight e2, bishop b7, the king can just move to b1, and white's actually doing better here. After knight c5 and knight g3, and something like d5 from black, white can actually now play knight h5. After knight takes e4, knight takes g7, white's doing a lot better here. So this was one idea that white could play. Instead, Tal didn't want to be known as a coward. He actually saw a really good positional sacrifice and he wanted to play it. And for this reason he opted to play bishop to d3 instead. So what this does is just eye up the king side with these two bishops raking down on the g7 square and the h7 square. Here Larsen played b4, attacking the knight, and this is where Tal's sacrifice comes into play. He played knight to d5 now, attacking the bishop, and Larsen just took it. After takes, what's happened is now Tal's played a positional sacrifice. So he sacrificed a knight to gain a positional advantage. What this does is opens up these two bishops, raking down these two pawns, ready to sacrifice at any moment. The h pawn can start rolling up. Queen h3 is also an option. And many grandmasters studied this position actually, and they said that after g6, h4 was white's best option to follow up the attack. Instead though, in this position, Larsen actually played f5, trying to block up the king side. Here Tal played rook de1, gaining the open file for an attack, and this is where Tal saw his positional sacrifice. He saw bishop to d8, and after queen to h5 and knight to c5, he saw bishop takes g7, which is an amazing move. And after the knight takes d3 check, c takes d3 would actually lose here to queen c7, so instead Tal would play king to b1, and after knight takes e1, g6 threatening mate on h7. So if the king takes g7, queen takes, the king moves, g7, rook f7, and get a knight, checkmate. And this is what Tal saw. And this is one of Tal's weaknesses. Once he sees a position like this, you just can't let go. And it's not always good to sacrifice your pieces and gain a massive attack if it doesn't work in the end. But I suppose you can't resist these positions. Instead though, playing bishop d8 and going into that, Larsen actually played rook f7. But now white's in a much better position. h4 was played, continuing the attack. And Larsen has to do the only thing he can, develop pieces. So after bishop b7 there's quite a lot of options for Tal. He could play g6 here, and after h takes, can play h5. And if g takes h5, it's game over after queen takes h5, with queen h8 coming in. Instead, Larsen could have played g5 here, and then just comes bishop takes f5 though. And if rook takes e7, and the knight and the pawn are both attacked at the same time. Queen f8 is considered the best move, but then just comes rook takes g7, queen takes, and black has to give up the queen. And rook g1, white's actually doing better here, even though black has 3 pieces for the queen. I think the pawns will decide the game here. Instead though, g6 was considered very risky. It's noted that Tal would probably play it if the circumstances were different, but bishop takes f5 as was played is perfectly reasonable. And rook takes f5, and now rook takes e7. Note that rook f7 doesn't work here because rook takes and king takes, and white can now follow with g6. And after h takes and play h5. Now g takes h5 here is suicide due to queen takes h5, and the king's just wide open. So I was thinking what would happen if black just decides to hide with knight f6, but it turns out this also loses to h takes. Again, taking that pawn suicide, so the king could hide, but then just comes rook e1 check, king f8, and bishop takes, pawn takes, and just queen h5. And even though black's a piece up, white's position is so much better and mate is going to come. Instead here, Larsen played knight to e5, attacking the queen. The pawn can't recapture because the rook's going to take the queen if it does. So here, Tal just played queen e4, attacking the rook, and queen f8's played, defending the rook and attacking white's rook. But now Tal played f takes e5, and if queen takes the rook, we can just recapture the other rook. And after bishop takes d5, just rook e1, and if now black captures this pawn, rook takes e5, and that bishop's lost. So instead of queen takes e7, Larsen played rook f4, attacking the queen, and Tal simply sidesteps this with queen to e3. Rook f3 is now played, attacking the queen again. Bishop takes d5 is another option, but then just comes e takes d6, and after rook takes d4, queen takes, bishop takes h1, and b3. Believe it or not, white's actually still winning this game. Even though black's a piece up, the pawn on b4 is very weak. This d pawn is going to get promoted very soon. It's hard for black to defend this g7 square. Instead, Larsen played rook f3, attacking the queen. The queen moves again to e2, and now black decides to take on e7. And of course white takes on f3, and d takes e5 is played. And Tal just pins this with rook e1. So we've not lost a pawn, and rook d8 from Larsen to attack this pawn on d5. But white can now defend it with rook takes e5, and after queen d6, just queen f4, and everything's secured. And now the big threat is rook e8 check, which would lead to a queen loss, as you'll see. So if bishop takes d5 here, let's say, white can now play rook e8 check, and if the rook captures, just the queen can capture the queen. So that would be game over. Instead, rook f8 is played from Larsen, attacking the queen, and Tal just moves it, sidesteps, queen to e4, everything's protected in the centre. Larsen here opts for b3, after a takes b3, rook f1 check, trying to gain an attack. Tal plays king to d2, and Larsen follows up with queen to b4 check, hoping there's some sort of attack here, but there isn't. c3 just secures everything. The queen's forced back, and bishop c5 is now played. A very interesting and great move, because after queen takes c5, here comes rook e8 check. After rook f8, Tal now plays queen to e6 check, and after king h8, and queen f7. Black now resigns. This is because if there's a capture, just queen takes, and that's going to lead to mate after queen f8, and that's mate. And where else is black to go? The only best move is queen takes d5 here, check. But after queen takes d5, rook takes e8 is forced, and then just queen takes b7, and white's clearing up. This is game over. So Tal went on to beat Larsen in the match and play Spassky, where he unfortunately lost and didn't get a chance to play Petrosian in the World Championships. But anyway, this is an amazing game, and how many of us would have the bottle to play knight d5 here? I don't think I certainly wouldn't in a normal competition. I don't think I'd ever think of this move. So anyway, hats off to the genius once again. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did, and I'll post more content soon. See you next time.